The Balfour Declaration unleashed a campaign of Zionist terrorism that is shockingly at odds with the prevailing narrative of Israel's birth, and more to the point, the very nature of Zionism. This history is not in question. It is preserved in British source documents, in mainstream media of the day, and in Zionist records. Today's tragedy in Israel-Palestine cannot be detached from this history of terrorism because the so-called conflict is that ongoing history. Balfour's legacy typically conjures images of the dispossession of non-Jewish Palestinians. Missing from this snapshot is the parallel violence against Jews that Balfour's signature set loose. Like its violence against the Palestinians, Zionism's anti-Jewish violence took two forms: physical violence and dehumanization, what one might call spiritual violence. For both peoples, the physical violence was to force mass human migration, just as Palestinians could not be removed from the land except by violence against them. Zionism could not install a critical mass of Jews in their place without violence against Jews. For Palestinians, this was ethnic cleansing and massacres, as well as starving them off the land by expropriating all means of livelihood. For Jews, the violence was more camouflaged. Its principal forms were the blocking of any safe haven outside of Palestine, manufactured violence to force the uprooting of Jews living elsewhere in peace, and the indoctrination of Jewish DPs, displaced people, and children into Zionist messianic fundamentalism. But all this is violence against civilians to force a political goal. That is to say, the Zionist project itself is by its very nature one of terrorism. And so Zionism needed two antidotes. One, it needed to reframe its terrorism as defense, which it accomplished by dehumanizing the Palestinians, the obstacle to its settler state, into an eternal threat, irredeemably violent as a race. And two, it needed extraordinary impunity, for which it dehumanized Jews, the means to its settler state. Zionism achieved this impunity by dehumanizing Jews into the settler state itself. Israel acts as the very embodiment of Jews, Jewish history, culture, and persecution, expropriating these and all they symbolize back to the Jewish kingdoms cited in the Old Testament, of which it claims to be the rebirth. And it reinforces this messianic facade by expropriating relevant archaeological artifacts as artifacts of the nation-state's history. In closed discussions, Ben-Gurion made no pretense about the cynicism of this. The reason they would call their state Israel, he said, was to get Jews to go there. It was brilliant marketing, and the military value of this is staggering, reducing Jewry to a human shield for the settler state and enabling Israel to frame criticism of it as criticism of Jews themselves, thus making criticism anti-Semitic by definition. But inescapably, this means that all Jews, simply because they are Jews, are then guilty of whatever the Israeli state does. Thus, Zionism, if we accept it, succeeds where all the bigots through the centuries never could. If we accept it, Zionism corrupts Jewry itself from within. And so the oft-heard question, does anti-Zionism necessarily equal anti-Semitism, is backwards. The question should be, is Zionism necessarily anti-Semitic? The Zionist cause was always held sacrosanct above all else, even during World War II and even when it frustrated the Allies' war efforts. And with the Allied victory, Zionism continued to claim its tribal, extra-national ownership over the war's Jewish survivors. It did not matter what, given the honest opportunity, the survivors might have wished for themselves as their individual self-determination. They were segregated from non-Jewish survivors and put into Zionist-run camps that were nothing short of indoctrination factories, tolerating no deviance from Zionist orthodoxy. Opportunities for hundreds of thousands of new homes in safe countries, like the United States and Britain, were sabotaged by Zionist leaders who needed the DPs to populate their settler state. A kidnapping campaign was waged to remove children of Jewish background from their adoptive European families because Zionism needed the children as facts on the ground. European Jewish children still in the camps were blocked from new homes, even new Jewish homes, if those homes were not in Palestine. Propaganda events, most famously the vessel Exodus, were staged at the expense of the welfare of Jewish survivors who were turned into sympathy victims and then forgotten once the theater was over. Jewish communities in the Middle East and North Africa were subjected to scare propaganda and false flag terrorism to ethnically cleanse Jews from their homelands to become second-class ethnic fodder in Israel. And when, in the 1980s, Jews were able to leave Russia and emigrate to the United States, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, former bigwig of the terror gang Lehi, successfully coerced U.S. President Reagan to close U.S. doors to them. It is consummate irony, then, that Zionism is now being flaunted as Jewish self-determination. It is exactly the opposite. It is the hijacking of that individual self-identity and self-determination by a political project that has been the cause of a century of misery, displacement, and death. Balfour and the other officials responsible knew in 1917, knew all along, that the declaration's polite phrase about no harm coming to the Palestinians was a lie. It was never a failure of good intentions. And as the years passed, the determination to seize and ethnically cleanse Palestine remained the explicit plan of the top Zionist leaders, Ben-Gurion, Weizmann, etc. Balfour lived long enough to see his signature translate into Zionist anti-Jewish violence. By 1924, the allegedly defensive Haganah, what would become the Israeli military, was already assassinating Jews for their opposition to Zionism. But Balfour did not live quite long enough to lose hope that the Zionists would double as surrogate empire builders for Britain. Rather, Zionist terrorism continued through World War II, and by 1946 was tearing Palestine apart as the Palestinians maintained stoic nonviolence. Anyone or anything that kept Palestine a functioning society was a target of the Zionists. Trains, roads, bridges, communications, oil facilities, and Coast Guard stations were constantly being bombed. Soldiers, utility workers, telephone repairmen, railway workers, bomb disposal personnel, anyone coming forward to help stop the terror were murdered. Police, and especially Jewish police, were long a favored target of the Zionists and were gunned down by the dozens. That Jewish children were indoctrinated and exploited was obvious at least as early as 1938, when the British caught the bomber of a Palestinian bus. She was 12 years old, egged on by 3 adults. Teenagers were commonly used for terror attacks, and those who resisted involvement in the militias were blocked from advancement in school. Among the smaller terror organizations that popped up was one specifically dedicated to preventing Jews from befriending non-Jews, the ultimate fear, of course, being polluting what for the Zionists was the pure Jewish race. As a sample of its methods, the terror group doused a disobedient Jewish girl with acid, severely injuring her and blinding her in one eye. Illustrative of the degree to which Zionist plans infiltrated the government in everyday life, a couple of months after one Coast Guard station was attacked and bombed by the Haganah, it blew up again, but the British were baffled because this time there had been no attack. It just blew up. They discovered that the construction crew that had rebuilt the station after the previous attack were Haganah and had simply embedded explosives in the reconstruction. But the worst problem of infiltration was in the military service, where deadly sabotage by Zionist plants who had joined the forces led, tragically, to orders to remove all Jews from service in Palestine because there was no way to tell them from the Zionists. By 1948, this problem spread to key medical personnel. After the Jewish agency poisoned the water supply of Acre with typhoid in order to expedite the ethnic cleansing of this city that lies on the Palestinian side of partition, the bacteriologist hired by the British proved to be a Haganah plant or sympathizer, an obstacle to the availability of the vaccine. Nor did Balfour live long enough to see his signature spread terrorism to Europe and Britain. His own embassy in Rome bombed. Allied trains in Austria bombed. Government buildings in London bombed. And a concerted, though almost entirely unsuccessful, campaign of letter bombs. 30 years and 27 days after Balfour signed his name, the UN capitulated to Zionist terrorism and passed UN Resolution 181 with its implicit creation of the Israeli state. The alternate UN plan was for a binational state, but this compromise would be, to quote British documents, totally unacceptable to the Zionists and, quote, would therefore be followed by an intensification of Jewish terrorism. That is, yet greater terrorism over that which had already brought Palestine to its knees. The disproportionately large land area the UN gave the Zionists in Resolution 181 was also a capitulation to Zionist terrorism. Again, quoting British sources, giving the Zionists so much land up front was an attempt to delay, not prevent, but merely delay the Zionist expansionist wars that they knew would come. But this appeasement, of course, failed because within a few months of Resolution 181, the Zionist militias were already waging their first expansionist war, confiscating more than half of the Palestinian side of partition. In the words of the High Commissioner at the time, the Zionists were jubilant with their campaign of calculated aggression coupled with brutality, the mortaring of terrified women and children. And the Zionist persecution of Jews who displeased them has, quote, reached medieval standards. The armistice that ended the 1948 war established a ceasefire line, essentially what would become known as the 67 borders, that, to quote from the agreement, is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. Israel was supposed to return to the agreed partition or other mutually agreed alternative, but it simply refused. Even if one accepts the legality of partition, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land began then, in 1948, not in 1967. Fast forward to today, and what is the living legacy of Britain's arrogance in giving away other people's land? Generations of people are condemned to life in camps because they are the wrong ethnicity. People live under a ruthless military occupation because they are the wrong ethnicity. And Gaza has been reduced to a laboratory for sadism and weapons proving. Were Balfour to be alive today, perhaps what for him would be the greatest irony is how his living declaration now corrupts British politics and censors speech and debate in Britain on behalf of the foreign state his signature helped jumpstart. The conflict could end tomorrow if the complicit nations, the United States, Britain, and the various European countries, stop enabling it. And lest this claim seem exaggerated, just imagine for a moment how the international community would react if the ethnicities in this so-called conflict were reversed. If the ethnicities were reversed, the international community would rush their militaries to the region to stop precisely what it now empowers and finances. It would suddenly demand an immediate end to race laws and apartheid and the creation of a secular democratic state of equals. And the international community would jump to proclaim that equality, obviously, means the unqualified right of return. It would suddenly be self-evident that you can't ethnically cleanse people and then say that equality does not apply to them because they're not present. The British government's refusal to acknowledge the sins of its predecessors is disgraceful, but it is the United States that since the mid-1940s has been the principal torchbearer of the Balfour Declaration, and so as Americans, it is our moral responsibility to make it history. Thank you.